Today, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to make 3 styles of cream puffs. I'll be going over your standard cream puffs, choux au craquelin, and a croquembouche, which is a tower of cream puffs bound by caramel threads. So, let's get started. So the thing that makes cream puffs different is the way that it rises to give you a chewy exterior and a hollow middle. Baked goods typically need some way to grow or spring upward in the oven. For muffins and loaves, they use baking powder or baking soda. Breads and croissants use yeast, but cream puffs are made from a batter called choux paste, and it uses steam. As the cream puffs bake, the heat from the oven causes the moisture inside the dough to evaporate, which then causes the cream puffs to expand outwards like a balloon. What's left is this light, hollow shell that can be filled with a variety of fillings. So now that we know what we're looking for, we need to figure out how to get there, and to make sure that our hollow shells don't collapse after baking. To a pot, we're going to add 112.5 grams of butter, 5 grams of sugar, 2.5 grams of salt, and 225 grams of water. In a separate bowl, we're going to measure out 175 grams of bread flour, and in a third bowl, we'll crack 5 eggs. We'll put that on a stovetop, turn on the heat, and let that boil. Now that it's boiling, we're going to add our bread flour all at once and stir rapidly to make a roux. You can turn off the heat or turn it to low during this point. In this clip, you see that I'm actually not stirring fast enough, so some of the flour isn't being incorporated and it's being left as little clumps. To fix this, I need to break them up with my hands or press them against the sides of the pot. If you leave these flour clumps, you could get a bite of raw flour in your cream puffs. Once the roux mixture is lump-free, we're going to let it cool. A quick way to do this is to transfer it to a mixing bowl and use the paddle attachment on low speed until it's about room temperature. You can definitely let this sit to cool, but it may take a while. The next step is to add our eggs, so if the mixture is too hot, you'll actually cook them and have scrambled eggs inside your cream puffs. We'll add our eggs one at a time to make sure that each egg is fully incorporated and the mixture looks uniform before adding the next one. Adding the eggs too fast may cause the mixture to have difficulty coming together into a smooth paste. You can see me periodically using the paddle to scrape down the very bottom of the bowl and making sure that everything looks the same. Once all the eggs are added and the batter is smooth, we can test the batter's consistency by taking our paddle or spatula and drawing a line through it. By doing this, we're actually testing how the batter will settle after we pipe it. We want it to be fluid enough so that it can flow through the piping bag, but we also want it to be strong enough so that it will hold its shape and not become a puddle. This batter consistency is really important to make sure that the cream puffs bake into balls and not cookies. You can see how the batter moves very slowly after drawing a line through it, sort of like lava. This is what you're looking for. If it's too stiff, you may need to add a tiny amount of additional eggs. Remember that you can always add more eggs, but you can't take them away, so make sure to only add a little bit at a time. Our batter is finished now, so now we're ready to pipe. I'm using a number 6 tip, which has about a 1 centimeter opening. If you don't have a piping bag or a tip, that's not a big deal. You can put your batter into a Ziploc bag and cut a hole in one of the bottom corners. Since this batter is pretty thick, a trick to get it down to the bottom is to use a plastic scraper or something flat to scrape the batter downwards. Once it's all in the bag, twist the top so that when you squeeze, it can only go in one direction. An easy way to hold a piping bag to give you maximum control is to hold it in your dominant hand with the twisted part in the crevice between your thumb and your index finger. Then use your non-dominant hand to guide and hold it steady. We're looking for our cream puffs to be about 1.5 inches in diameter. This process can be deceptively tricky, so take your time and don't worry if you mess up. We can always fix them later. A couple quick tips. When squeezing, make sure to keep the piping tip about 1 centimeter above the parchment paper, and more or less just kind of keep it there. Once it's the correct size, stop squeezing and do a little twirl to release the batter. You may be tempted to lift up your hand when you're piping, but as you can see right here, the batter only moves upwards and not outwards. Lastly, we're going to dip our finger in some water and press down on those points. This here will make sure that they don't burn and also so that the cream puffs bake into a round shape. Again, piping is probably the most difficult part of this entire process, so just practice and keep at it. If you mess up, don't worry, you can simply scrape the batter off of the sheet, put it back into your piping bag, and try again. These cream puffs are technically ready for the oven, but we do something a little bit differently if we're going for the Craquelin cream puffs. The main difference is that the Craquelin ones have a cookie crust on top. So if you're making these, you can go and make the cookie topping anytime before the piping. Or you can even just let the piped batter just hang out while you make it. To a bowl, we'll add 62.5 grams of bread flour, 62.5 grams of sugar, half a gram of salt, and 57 grams of unsalted butter. Then you can either use a machine or mix it by hand until it all comes together. This is a pretty small amount, so doing it by hand is totally fine. From there, we'll roll it out until it's just about half a centimeter thick. I'm using a piece of parchment paper folded in half to make it cleaner. Now we can keep it in the fridge till we're ready to use it, or put it in the freezer for like 2 minutes to make the cutting easier. When you're ready, get a cookie cutter that's just barely larger than your piped out batter. This will be around 1.5 to 2 inches, and simply cut out the rounds and then place them on top. Just like normal cookies, you can take your scraps, roll them out again, and cut out more. These are finally all ready for the oven. We'll bake at a high temperature of 415 degrees Fahrenheit to generate that steam, and after 15 minutes, we'll release the steam by opening the door. Then we'll turn the oven down to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll have it at about 400 for maybe 10 to 15 minutes and rotate our pans halfway through so that they bake evenly. This part right here will determine whether your cream puffs collapse or not. Because they're hollow inside, they need to firm up and be dry enough before taking them out of the oven. Because of this, I would bake them on the slightly longer side. When they're done, we'll let them cool completely while we get our whipped cream ready. But if you don't have time to do it all in one day, you can actually freeze these unfilled shells once they're completely cooled. Cream puffs can actually be filled with whatever you want, like pastry cream, chocolate ganache, but I'm going to teach you the ins and outs of how to make a perfect whipping cream. We'll start with 400 grams of whipped cream in a bowl and whip it on medium-high speed. Whipped cream is relatively easy, but there are a couple things that you need to look out for. I think it's best to not use a timer and to basically go by looks. First, the cream will look completely liquid, and then eventually ripples will start to remain as the cream starts to come together. Recipes using whipped cream will either call for soft peaks or stiff peaks. The soft peak stage is when you lift up your whisk and the tip of the cream flops over or droops. Stiff peak stage is when the tip completely holds its form. When we hit the soft peak stage, we're going to sift in 100 grams of icing sugar. Then we're going to continue beating until we hit the stiff peak stage. The reason we add the icing sugar earlier and not at the very end is because we don't want to over whip that cream. Too much whipping will make the cream start to look grainy and it will take on a yellowish color. What's happening is that the fat actually begins to separate and the cream starts to become smooth like butter. If this happens, don't worry, we can actually still save it. Just pour a little bit of that fresh cream back into the mixture and re-whip it while keeping a very careful eye. The time it takes to go from soft peak to stiff peak stage can actually be less than 10 seconds. So if you're worried, you can actually do the final whipping by hand. We have all of our parts assembled and now we can finally fill them. We'll be using a piping bag again, and there are two methods you can use. You can cut out holes in the bottom of the cream puffs with a knife or scissors and fill them up that way, or you can use a knife to cut the cream puffs in half. Use whatever way works for you, but if you cut them in half and fill them, you're able to see the cream, and that can give it a little bit more of an aesthetic look. To finish off the normal cream puffs, you can dust a little bit of powdered sugar on top. This is gonna look really nice, especially during the holiday season. These cream puffs are super classic and everything you would expect them to be. Light and subtly sweet. The Craquelin cream puffs are probably my favorite. Just having that crunch on top adds an extra texture layer and it makes it super satisfying. It's a little bit similar to Japanese melon bread because it has that crunchy, soft contrast. Now we're gonna tackle the French wedding cake. This is basically just a cream puff tower that's held together by caramelized sugar and then decorated with caramel strands. We have all of the pieces ready, so now what we need to do is just basically make the caramel and assemble it. In theory, caramel is actually just heating up sugar in a pot with a little bit of water until it changes color, but there are some things that you really need to watch out for. The one thing that we're really trying to avoid is what's called crystallization. You may have seen this happen to honey, but if there are any impurities or contaminants in the pot while you're caramelizing the sugar, it can create these little sugar crystals. One crystal is all it takes to spread and infect the entire batch of sugar. And if that happens, it's usually just easier to start all over again than to try and save it. So here's how we're gonna avoid this. To a pot, we'll add 200 grams of sugar and just enough water to barely cover it. Then we'll turn on the heat. Crystallization usually happens when sugar particles are stuck to the sides of the pot. The crystals heat up faster and they might burn, and then if they are reintroduced to the rest of the caramel, it'll start a chain reaction. So to combat this, we're gonna do a combination of two things. The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna take a pastry brush and we're gonna dip it in water. Then we're gonna brush it on the sides of the pot. The water will run down and catch any sugar that might be on the sides. The second thing we're gonna do is we're gonna use a lid. Water will evaporate and condense on the lid, then flow down the sides of the pot to wash out any sugar. From there, it's basically just a waiting game. If you've never done this before, it might be helpful to use a candy thermometer. Once the sugar hits 116 degrees Celsius, it'll be nearly ready. But you can actually tell based on looks as well. When the liquid is bubbling really rapidly, that's the water evaporating. Once the bubbles become slower and look a lot thicker, that's when all the water is evaporated and it's the liquid sugar that's bubbling. At this point, keep a close eye on it because it will eventually change its color. Once you start to see that yellow color, you can slowly swirl the pot to make the color look more even. This golden amber color is what you're looking for. I think at this point it's just better to take it off the stove and just work with it. A different technique that I saw was that you can stop the cooking completely by dipping the bottom of the pot in a bowl of water, and this will prevent the color from changing even further, but what I found is that the sugar becomes really solid really quickly and it made it more difficult to work with. Now we can assemble. I started off by using tongs to dip the cream puffs, but eventually I found that using your hands gives you so much more control and you won't break them. Again, as you're working, it's possible that the caramel may become too solid and you'll need to reheat it on the stove just to make it more easy to work with. Once the tower is built, the final part is to use the caramel to create strands. Make sure to put a piece of parchment paper underneath your workstation to make cleanup just so much easier. With your heated caramel and a mini spatula or spoon, dip the utensil in the caramel, lift it up, and allow the caramel to drip off. Initially, the caramel will come off in droplets, but as it gets closer to what we want it to be, eventually it will become a continuous strand. When it's the right consistency, you'll very quickly flick your utensil back and forth relatively high above the tower so that the strands can solidify in the air and fall onto the tower. Honestly, this part is a little bit tricky, so it'll take some trial and error as to find when the right time to flick is. You can see here that for my first couple flicks, the sugar is too hot and it's not forming strands. As I continue to check out the consistency, the sugar hardens and I get it eventually. The good thing here is that even if the sugar isn't at the right consistency, you won't ruin all your hard work. As you keep putting on strands, eventually you can add in circular motions with your utensil. And when you're done, you can use your hands to gather the fallen sugar and wrap it around the tower. The sugar can actually be pretty sharp, so you may want to use gloves for this. Those splatters of caramel actually come off pretty easy, so you can remove them to make it look a little bit nicer. We're finally done! So just take a moment and admire your hard work before we get to tasting. Alright, let's give it a try. You would think that it would just be simply cream puffs with sugar on it, but the caramel actually adds an ever so slight bitterness in a way that it kind of adds a lot more depth, sort of similar to how you have a burnt cheesecake. And because the caramel is also firmer, it adds a texture difference and contrast against the soft cream puff. Overall, I'm a pretty big fan. And there you have it, 3 styles of cream puffs: the standard and the beloved, the fancy and distinguished, and the grandiose. No matter which way you decide to have them, they're a super light dessert and you can't really just have one of them. This was actually my first time making the Croquembouche. Overall, it went smoothly, but if I had to do it again, I would remember not to get too frustrated at myself if the sugar starts to crystallize. It really doesn't take that much time to make another batch. And thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, see ya!